Welcome, fellow wanderer, to the darkest chambers of humanity's final experiment. Tonight, we descend into the steel tombs that promise salvation, but delivered only suffering, the vaults of America. In these sanctuaries turned laboratories, Vault Tech conducted their most twisted research on the human soul. Close your eyes and let the weight of their secrets wash over you. Like the hum of recycled air through endless corridors, we'll walk together through each horror, each betrayal, each moment where hope died behind sealed doors. Rest now as we explore the complete catalogue of humanity's cruelest experiments, hidden beneath the earth. Welcome to the shadow realm of absolute authority, where freedom dies not in the chaos of war, but in the ordered corridors of perpetual control. Tonight we explore the philosophy that turned protectors into prisoners, examining how Vault 101 became the perfect laboratory for understanding human submission and the devastating cost of challenging those who claim dominion over our lives. The concept of the overseer began long before the bombs fell, rooted in humanity's oldest fears of chaos and disorder. Vault Tech understood that survival required more than steel walls and recycled air. It demanded the complete subjugation of human will to systematic control. The Overseer program represented their most sophisticated experiment in psychological dominance, transforming natural leaders into absolute dictators through careful cultivation of paranoia, isolation, and unchecked power. Vault 101 stood as the crown jewel of this authoritarian philosophy, a gleaming monument to the principle that freedom was a luxury humanity could no longer afford. Located beneath the ruins of what had once been suburban Maryland, the vault promised security to its carefully selected inhabitants, while concealing its true purpose, the creation of a society so perfectly controlled that the very concept of leaving would become literally unthinkable to those trapped within its walls. The selection process for Vault 101's inhabitants was meticulous beyond any practical need for survival, revealing the experiment's true nature through its obsessive attention to psychological profiles rather than genetic diversity or technical skills. Vault Tech recruited families who demonstrated strong tendencies toward conformity and respect for authority, screening out individuals with histories of rebellion, creative thinking, or independent problem-solving. They wanted sheep who would accept shepherding without question, not wolves who might challenge the shepherd's right to lead. The Vault's first overseer, Jacob Palmer, entered his position believing genuinely in his role as protector and guide for the community under his care. Vault Tech had provided him with extensive training in leadership, crisis management, and community organization, but they had also planted seeds of paranoia through classified briefings about the dangers of dissent and the necessity of absolute control. Palmer genuinely believed that any deviation from established protocol represented an existential threat to everyone's survival. The architecture of Vault 101 reflected its purpose as a prison disguised as sanctuary, with every design choice calculated to reinforce the inhabitants' dependence on centralized authority while making independent thought increasingly difficult to sustain. The Overseer's office occupied the vault's highest level, symbolically and literally elevated above the living spaces of common residents. Multiple security checkpoints controlled movement between sections, creating artificial barriers that transformed simple activities into permissions requiring official approval. The Vault's communication systems epitomized the sophisticated nature of Vault Tech's control mechanisms, allowing the Overseer to monitor all conversations while maintaining complete control over information flow between residents. Private communications were impossible, creating an atmosphere where every word might be recorded and analyzed for signs of disloyalty. The residents learned to police their own thoughts, understanding that even casual complaints about vault conditions could be interpreted as dangerous sedition requiring corrective action. Palmer's transformation from protector to tyrant occurred gradually, so slowly that even he failed to recognize how completely his role had corrupted his original intentions. The daily briefings from Vault-Tech's computer systems provided him with detailed psychological profiles of every resident, highlighting potential troublemakers and suggesting intervention strategies. What began as legitimate concern for community welfare evolved into obsessive surveillance and preemptive punishment of anyone who might potentially challenge his authority. The Vault's educational system served as perhaps the most insidious aspect of its control mechanisms, indoctrinating children from birth with the fundamental principle that life outside the Vault was impossible and undesirable. History lessons emphasized the horrors of surface existence, while portraying the Vault as humanity's only hope for survival. Children learned that questioning authority was not just dangerous, but morally wrong, a betrayal of everyone who depended on ordered society for protection from chaos. The daily routine in Vault 101 was structured with military precision, eliminating any opportunity for spontaneous activity or unsupervised interaction between residents. Work assignments, meal times, recreation periods, and even sleep schedules were regulated by central authority, creating a rhythm of life that made independent thought increasingly difficult to sustain. Residents who struggled with this regimentation were diagnosed with psychological disorders requiring treatment through isolation and behavioral modification. Palmer's son Freddie represented the Vault's greatest success story, a young man so thoroughly conditioned to accept authority that he genuinely could not conceive of existence beyond the Vault's walls. Freddie had been raised to view the outside world as a place of death and horror, where radiation and mutants made survival impossible for anyone foolish enough to abandon the safety of controlled environment. His absolute faith in Vault authority made him the perfect candidate to succeed his father as overseer, ensuring continuity of the control system across generations. The Vault's medical facilities served dual purposes as healing centers and enforcement mechanisms, with Dr. Jonas Palmer, the overseer's brother and head physician, using his position to identify and treat any resident who showed signs of psychological independence or curiosity about surface conditions. Medical records were shared directly with Vault security, making doctor visits potential intelligence-gathering operations disguised as healthcare. Residents learned to hide any symptoms that might be interpreted as evidence of mental instability or dangerous thinking. The transformation of Jonas Palmer from healer to enforcer illustrated how completely the Vault's power structure corrupted even those with the best intentions, turning medical professionals into agents of political control through gradual normalization of surveillance and punishment. Jonas genuinely believed that treating curiosity about the surface as a dangerous mental illness served the greater good by protecting residents from knowledge that might motivate them to attempt impossible and suicidal escapes. The Vault's recreation facilities were carefully designed to channel any creative or independent impulses into approved activities that reinforced rather than challenged the existing power structure. Art projects focused on celebrating Vault life and authority figures, while sports programs emphasized teamwork and following rules rather than individual achievement or competitive thinking. Even entertainment was regulated, with books, movies, and music selected to reinforce messages about the necessity of order and the dangers of questioning established systems. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance gradually broke down the social bonds between residents, replacing natural human relationships with artificial hierarchies based on loyalty to authority rather than genuine affection or shared interests. Friends became informants. Family members reported each other's suspicious activities, and romantic relationships required official approval to ensure they would not create divided loyalties that might challenge Vault unity. The generation born within the Vault represented Vault-Tech's ultimate victory over human nature, children who knew no existence beyond controlled environment and could not imagine wanting freedom they had never experienced. These young people accepted surveillance as protection, viewed questioning authority as moral failure, and genuinely believed that their leaders possessed wisdom and knowledge beyond ordinary human understanding. They were perfect citizens of a totalitarian state, incapable of recognizing their own imprisonment. But even the most sophisticated control systems could not entirely eliminate the human capacity for growth and change, as demonstrated by the gradual awakening of James, a Vault scientist whose research into water purification technology began to reveal inconsistencies in official explanations about surface conditions. James's access to restricted areas and classified information gradually exposed him to evidence that contradicted everything residents had been taught about the impossibility of surface survival. The discovery that the Vault's door was fully functional and could be opened at any time represented a moment of profound psychological crisis for James, forcing him to confront the reality that their imprisonment was voluntary rather than necessary, chosen rather than imposed by circumstances beyond their control. The knowledge that they were living as prisoners by choice rather than necessity transformed his understanding of everything he had accepted about Vault life and authority. James's secret research project became his pathway to psychological freedom, providing him with purpose and direction independent of Vault authority, while slowly building his confidence that life beyond the Vault's walls might be possible. His work on Project Purity represented more than scientific advancement. It symbolized hope that human beings could create positive change in the world, rather than simply accepting whatever conditions authority figures deemed acceptable. The relationship between James and his daughter, the future lone wanderer, became the Vault's greatest vulnerability, representing the transmission of independent thinking from one generation to the next, despite all efforts to prevent such contamination of approved thought patterns. James's careful cultivation of curiosity and critical thinking in his daughter created exactly the kind of psychological independence that the Vault system was designed to prevent. The morning of James's escape represented the complete failure of Vault 101's control mechanisms, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated psychological conditioning could not entirely eliminate the human capacity for rebellion when confronted with unbearable moral compromise. His decision to leave the Vault was not spontaneous, but the culmination of years of growing awareness that his continued participation in the system made him complicit in the imprisonment of everyone he claimed to love. The chaos that followed James's departure revealed how completely the Vault's social order depended on the illusion of impossibility rather than genuine acceptance of authority, with residents suddenly questioning assumptions they had never previously examined. Overseer Palmer's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control through enhanced surveillance and punishment only accelerated the breakdown of trust that had sustained the system for decades. The lone wanderer's emergence from the Vault completed the destruction of its control mechanisms while proving that surface survival was not only possible but preferable to the psychological death of perpetual imprisonment. The open Vault door became a symbol of liberation rather than danger, inviting other residents to reconsider their assumptions about safety, security, and the price of accepting authority without question. The philosophical implications of Vault 101's experiment extend far beyond the specific circumstances of post-war survival, revealing universal truths about power, authority, and human nature that apply to any society where leaders claim the right to make decisions for others without their genuine consent. The Vault's history demonstrates how easily protective institutions can become oppressive systems when those in power prioritize control over the genuine welfare of those they claim to serve. The lasting legacy of Vault 101 lies not in its failure as a control mechanism, but in its demonstration that human beings possess an innate drive toward freedom that cannot be permanently suppressed through even the most sophisticated techniques of psychological manipulation. The Vault's collapse proves that systems based on deception and control contain the seeds of their own destruction, ultimately failing because they deny rather than embrace the essential humanity of those they seek to govern. Enter now the realm where trust becomes poison and salvation transforms into damnation, where Vault 12 stood as monument to humanity's most fundamental betrayal. Here, beneath the California desert, Vault-Tec crafted their cruelest deception, a perfect sanctuary designed from its very conception to fail, turning the promise of protection into a slow-motion apocalypse that would transform human beings into the very monsters their neighbors would learn to fear and despise. The marketing campaign for Vault 12 represented Vault-Tec's most ambitious public relations triumph, positioning the facility as the crown jewel of their entire shelter program. Television advertisements featured gleaming corridors filled with happy families, state-of-the-art medical facilities, and revolutionary water purification systems that would ensure not just survival but prosperity in the post-war world. The Vault was marketed specifically as America's perfect shelter, complete with amenities that exceeded even luxury hotel standards. Families selected for Vault 12 represented the cream of American middle-class society, chosen not for their survival skills or technical expertise, but for their embodiment of traditional values and social stability. The resident selection process favored teachers, small business owners, civil servants, and skilled tradespeople, individuals whose presence would create a harmonious community capable of rebuilding civilization exactly as it had existed before the bombs fell. These were people who trusted institutions, respected authority, and believed deeply in the American promise of progress through cooperation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the Vault's chief medical officer, had devoted her pre-war career to developing revolutionary treatments for radiation exposure, working under government contract to create protocols that would save lives in the event of nuclear accident or attack. Her assignment to Vault 12 seemed like the perfect opportunity to implement her life's work in protecting innocent civilians from the medical consequences of atomic warfare. She entered the Vault with genuine enthusiasm for her humanitarian mission. The Vault's engineering systems incorporated the most advanced radiation shielding technology available, with multiple redundant barriers designed to protect residents from even direct nuclear strikes in their immediate vicinity. The facility's power systems, air filtration, and structural integrity all exceeded military specifications, creating what appeared to be an impenetrable fortress against the atomic age's ultimate weapon. Every technical inspection confirmed that Vault 12 could protect its inhabitants indefinitely. Construction supervisor James Morrison had overseen every aspect of the Vault's assembly, taking personal pride in creating what he believed would be humanity's safest refuge from nuclear catastrophe. His teams had installed radiation detection equipment throughout the facility, emergency medical supplies for treating exposure symptoms, and decontamination systems capable of cleansing anything that entered the Vault. Morrison genuinely believed he was building mankind's greatest achievement in protective architecture, but buried deep within the Vault's construction blueprints, hidden in technical specifications that only the highest level Vault-Tec engineers ever saw, lay the facility's true purpose, encoded in seemingly innocent design modifications. The massive blast door that should have sealed the vault completely had been fitted with hydraulic systems programmed to fail at a predetermined moment, ensuring that the barrier between safety and contamination would remain permanently compromised. The door's failure mechanism was a masterpiece of engineering disguised as protective redundancy, incorporating multiple backup systems that were actually designed to prevent closure rather than ensure it. Hydraulic lines were manufactured with microscopic flaws that would rupture under the stress of sealing operations, while electronic controls included override circuits that would interpret closure commands as maintenance requests, requiring the door to remain open for safety inspections. Project lead Dr. Marcus Webb understood the true nature of Vault 12's mission, having been briefed directly by Vault-Tech's executive leadership about the company's need to study long-term radiation exposure effects on stable family units. His research proposal had emphasized the unique opportunity to observe gradual genetic changes across multiple generations, providing invaluable data for understanding human adaptation to the post-nuclear world that atomic warfare would inevitably create. The families who entered Vault 12 on that October morning in 2077 carried with them the normal anxieties and hopes of people facing uncertain times, but also the fundamental trust that their government and its corporate partners would protect them as promised. Children clutched favorite toys while parents gathered important documents, everyone believing they were taking temporary shelter until the danger passed and they could return to their normal lives. The first hours inside the vault exceeded everyone's expectations, with families settling into spacious living quarters that offered privacy and comfort beyond what most had enjoyed in their pre-war homes. The common areas buzzed with social activity as neighbors introduced themselves and children made new friends, creating the foundation for what seemed destined to become a thriving underground community. Even the adults found themselves optimistic about their prospects for building a better society during their temporary isolation. The blast door's failure to close was initially interpreted as a minor technical malfunction that maintenance crews would resolve within hours, causing no particular alarm among residents who had been assured that all vault systems included multiple redundancies and fail-safes. Engineering staff worked diligently to diagnose and repair what they assumed was a simple hydraulic problem, unaware that every attempt to fix the system only triggered additional failures built into its design. Dr. Chen noticed the first radiation readings within 6 hours of the door failure, initially dismissing the low-level contamination as residual atmospheric particles that would dissipate once the sealing problem was resolved. Her medical training had prepared her to handle radiation exposure emergencies, but the readings she observed were unlike anything in her experience. Not the acute spikes associated with nuclear accidents, but the steady, persistent contamination that suggested continuous source exposure. The children were affected first, their developing bodies more susceptible to cellular damage from the invisible poison that seeped through the vault's compromised entrance. Parents began noticing unusual fatigue, unexplained nausea, and skin irritations that Dr. Chen initially attributed to stress-related symptoms common in high-anxiety situations. Her treatment protocols focused on supportive care and psychological counseling, approaches that were utterly inadequate for addressing radiation syndrome. By the third day, hair loss had begun among the youngest residents, creating alarm that could no longer be dismissed as temporary adjustment difficulties. Dr. Chen's examination of affected children revealed cellular changes consistent with chronic radiation exposure, forcing her to confront the terrible possibility that their shelter had become a trap rather than sanctuary. Her requests for emergency evacuation were denied by Vault-Tech officials, who insisted that surface conditions remained too dangerous for any exit attempts. The transformation from human to ghoul occurred gradually over weeks and months. allowing residents to witness their own metamorphosis with horrifying clarity as familiar faces became increasingly alien and disturbing. Skin began to decay and slough away, revealing underlying tissue that somehow remained functional despite its grotesque appearance. Hair disappeared entirely, while eyes became clouded and voices grew harsh from damaged vocal cords. Thomas Anderson, a high school mathematics teacher, kept detailed journals documenting his family's physical deterioration as both scientific record and coping mechanism for psychological trauma that exceeded anything human beings were designed to endure. His writing captured not just the medical progression of ghoulification, but the emotional devastation of watching loved ones become unrecognizable while retaining enough humanity to understand what they had lost. The psychological impact of transformation proved even more traumatic than the physical changes, as residents struggled to maintain relationships and community bonds, while their appearances became increasingly monstrous. Marriages strained under the pressure of spouses who could barely recognize each other, while parent-child relationships suffered as family members became afraid of their own relatives' disturbing new appearances. Children adapted to ghoulification more successfully than adults, their psychological flexibility allowing them to accept their transformed state as simply another aspect of their lived experience. But parents faced the heartbreak of seeing their offspring become creatures that surface dwellers would inevitably view as abominations, knowing that their children's futures had been destroyed by the very institution that had promised to protect them. The vault's social structure gradually collapsed as traditional human interactions became impossible between individuals whose appearances triggered instinctive revulsion and fear. Community meetings devolved into heated arguments about responsibility for their situation, while recreational activities ceased entirely as residents became too self-conscious about their transformed appearances to participate in group functions. Dr. Chen's medical supplies proved entirely inadequate for treating conditions that had never been encountered in normal medical practice, forcing her to develop new protocols through trial and error, while watching patients suffer from symptoms that no textbook had prepared her to address. Her own transformation into a ghoul compromised her ability to provide care, while adding personal psychological trauma to her professional challenges. The vault's food production systems continued functioning normally, but residents found their dietary needs changed dramatically by their transformation, with some foods becoming inedible, while others provided nutrition in unexpected ways. The community's agricultural specialists, themselves transformed into ghouls, worked to adapt their growing methods to serve their population's evolving biological requirements. By the summer of 2083, Vault 12's population had stabilized in their new forms, no longer undergoing active transformation, but permanently changed into beings that retained human intelligence and memory, while inhabiting bodies that surface dwellers would perceive as nightmarish monsters. The decision to leave the vault was driven not by hope for better conditions outside, but by desperation to escape the daily reminder of what they had lost. The exodus from Vault 12 was both liberation and exile, as the ghoul population emerged into a world that had indeed been devastated by nuclear war, but was beginning to recover in ways that offered hope for some forms of life. Their first encounters with human survivors revealed the social consequences of their transformation, as fear and prejudice created barriers that prevented integration with the emerging post-war communities. The establishment of Necropolis represented both triumph and tragedy, demonstrating the ghouls' ability to create functional society while highlighting their permanent separation from the human race they had once belonged to. The city became a refuge for others who had suffered similar transformations, creating a community united by shared trauma and mutual understanding of their unique position in the post-war world. The psychological legacy of Vault 12 extended far beyond its direct victims, influencing how post-war society viewed both ghouls and the institutions that had created them. The Vault's survivors became living testimony to the consequences of blind trust in authority figures who prioritized research objectives over human welfare, serving as warnings for future generations about the dangers of surrendering personal autonomy to organizations that claim to act in the public interest. Dr. Chen's transformation from healer to victim illustrated the particular tragedy of professionals who had devoted their lives to helping others, only to discover that their expertise was being exploited to cause the very suffering they had trained to prevent. Her continued medical practice among the ghoul population represented both penance and purpose, using her skills to serve those whom society had abandoned, while carrying the knowledge that her own trust in institutions had contributed to their suffering. The children of Vault 12 grew to adulthood, knowing that their deformities were not accidents of nature, but deliberate consequences of human cruelty disguised as scientific progress, creating psychological burdens that would influence their relationships with both their own kind and the human societies that viewed them with fear and disgust. Their resilience in building meaningful lives, despite such profound betrayal, testified to the strength of human spirit, even when housed in transformed flesh. The vault itself remained a monument to institutional betrayal, long after its population had departed, its open door serving as a permanent reminder that protection could become persecution, when those in power valued knowledge more than the lives of those who had trusted them with their safety and welfare. Step now into the digital purgatory, where consciousness becomes plaything, and reality bends to the whims of a madman drunk on absolute power. In Vault 112, beneath Smith Casey's garage in the capital wasteland, Dr. Stanislaus Braun constructed the most sophisticated torture chamber ever devised by human imagination. A virtual reality prison, where death offered no escape and suffering could be refined to artistic perfection through the endless manipulation of trapped souls who had trusted technology to deliver them paradise. The genesis of Vault 112 lay not in wartime necessity, but in the boundless ambition of a brilliant mind unrestrained by moral consideration, as Dr. Braun pursued his vision of human consciousness liberated from the limitations of physical existence. His pre-war research had focused on the therapeutic potential of virtual reality environments, developing systems that could provide psychological healing and experiential education through completely immersive digital worlds that felt more real than reality itself. Braun's reputation as a visionary scientist had been built on genuine innovations that improved countless lives, including the revolutionary Garden of Eden creation kit that would theoretically enable survivors to rebuild civilization from radioactive wasteland. His work with Vault Tech represented the culmination of decades spent pushing the boundaries of human-computer interaction, creating interfaces so sophisticated that users could experience complete sensory immersion in artificial environments, indistinguishable from physical reality. The selection process for Vault 112's 85 residents emphasized psychological profiles rather than survival skills, with Braun personally choosing individuals whose mental characteristics would provide interesting subjects for his experiments in consciousness manipulation. He sought people with strong family bonds, creative personalities, and rich emotional lives, qualities that would make their suffering more complex and therefore more scientifically valuable when subjected to his virtual torments. Sarah Lyons, a pre-war librarian, entered the vault with her young son and elderly father, believing they were participating in an advanced preservation program that would protect them from nuclear war while allowing them to experience educational simulations during their underground isolation. The promotional materials had emphasized the system's ability to provide entertainment, education, and psychological support through immersive experiences that would make their time in the vault feel like an adventure rather than imprisonment. The virtual reality pods that lined Vault 112's central chamber represented the pinnacle of pre-war technological achievement, incorporating brain-computer interfaces that could monitor and manipulate every aspect of conscious experience. The pods themselves appeared comfortable and welcoming, resembling luxury sleeping chambers, equipped with life support systems designed to maintain physical health, while consciousness explored infinite digital realms. Braun's initial presentations to the residents emphasized the voluntary nature of their participation in the virtual reality program, describing it as an opportunity to experience worlds beyond imagination while their bodies remained safely preserved in the vault's controlled environment. He explained that the system would allow them to live entire lifetimes in simulated realities, experiencing adventures and achievements impossible in the physical world, while maintaining their memories and relationships with fellow vault dwellers. The transition into virtual reality was designed to feel gradual and natural, with residents initially experiencing enhanced dreams that slowly evolved into fully immersive simulations where they retained complete awareness of their identities and relationships. The first virtual environments were idyllic representations of pre-war American life, featuring perfect suburban neighborhoods where families could live in comfort and safety while enjoying idealized versions of the lives they had left behind. Tranquility Lane emerged as Braun's masterpiece of psychological manipulation, a simulation designed to appear as the perfect American suburb circa 1958, complete with white picket fences, manicured lawns, and neighbors who embodied every positive stereotype of mid-20th century community life. The residents found themselves inhabiting bodies that reflected their idealized self-images, while retaining their authentic memories and personalities from the pre-war world. But the perfection of Tranquility Lane was artificial and therefore unsustainable, requiring constant intervention from Braun to maintain the illusion of harmony and contentment. When natural human conflicts arose, or residents began questioning aspects of their environment that seemed inconsistent with their memories, Braun would intervene directly to resolve problems through increasingly heavy-handed manipulations of their experiences and perceptions. Betty, Braun's avatar within the simulation, appeared as an innocent 10-year-old girl whose cherubic appearance concealed the consciousness of a 200-year-old scientist whose understanding of human psychology had been corrupted by decades of absolute power over other people's experiences. Through Betty, Braun could interact with his subjects while maintaining the pretense that their virtual world operated according to natural laws rather than his arbitrary whims. The first torments were subtle, beginning with minor inconveniences and social tensions that Braun introduced to observe how residents would respond to stress within their artificial paradise. He would cause appliances to malfunction at crucial moments, create misunderstandings between neighbors that escalated into feuds, and introduce external threats that required community cooperation to resolve. These initial experiments provided him with detailed data about each resident's personality traits and psychological vulnerabilities. As Braun grew bored with subtle manipulations, his interventions became increasingly dramatic and cruel, transforming Tranquility Lane from idyllic suburb into a theater for elaborate psychological tortures. He began orchestrating scenarios where residents were forced to witness terrible things happening to their loved ones, creating moral dilemmas that pitted their personal values against their survival instincts while recording their responses for analysis. The pint-sized slasher scenario represented Braun's evolution from observer to active torturer, as he introduced a masked killer into Tranquility Lane who would systematically murder residents in increasingly creative ways. The slasher appeared to operate independently, but every aspect of its behavior was controlled by Braun, who used the killer as an instrument for studying how people responded to random violence and unpredictable threats to their safety. Residents who died in the simulations discovered that death offered no escape from Braun's experiments, as he would resurrect them with full memories of their demise, while erasing their recollections of how they had died. This cycle of death and resurrection created profound psychological trauma as victims retained emotional memory of their suffering while losing the cognitive context that might have helped them process and overcome their experiences. The memory erasures were never complete, leaving residents with fragmentary recollections of trauma that felt real but could not be explained or understood. They would wake in Tranquility Lane with unexplained fears, inexplicable phobias, and persistent anxieties that had no apparent source, creating psychological instability that made them more interesting subjects for Braun's ongoing experiments in consciousness manipulation. Martha Simpson, a pre-war teacher, became one of Braun's favorite subjects due to her strong maternal instincts and protective relationships with other residents. He would repeatedly place her in situations where she could save others only by sacrificing herself, recording her decisions while analyzing the psychological mechanisms that drove her altruistic behavior. Each scenario was designed to push her moral reasoning to its breaking point. The Rockwell family suffered particularly elaborate torments, as Braun explored the dynamics of family relationships under extreme stress, creating scenarios where parents were forced to choose between their children's welfare and the survival of the community. He would manipulate their emotions directly, inducing artificial love, hatred, and indifference to observe how changes in emotional state affected their behavioral patterns and decision-making processes. Old Man Harris became the subject of experiments in identity dissolution, as Braun gradually erased and rewritten aspects of his personality to determine which characteristics were essential to maintaining personal continuity. Harris experienced cycles of forgetting and remembering his own identity, sometimes believing he was different people entirely, while retaining enough awareness to recognize that something fundamental about his existence was being violated. The Chinese invasion scenario represented Braun's attempt to recreate wartime trauma within the controlled environment of the simulation, subjecting residents to experiences of enemy occupation, resource scarcity, and survival stress, while monitoring how these experiences affected their social bonds and individual psychological resilience. He paid particular attention to how artificial trauma compared to the authentic memories his subjects retained from their pre-war lives. Braun's scientific detachment gradually eroded as he became emotionally invested in his subjects' suffering, deriving personal satisfaction from their pain rather than maintaining the objective stance of a researcher studying human behavior. His experiments evolved from investigations of psychological principles into elaborate revenge fantasies against a human race that he had come to view with contempt and disgust. The loop structure of the simulations ensured that no lesson could be learned, no growth could occur, and no adaptation could provide relief from Braun's torments. Residents would experience character development and emotional healing, only to have their progress erased and their suffering renewed with each reset of the program. Their consciousness remained trapped in eternal recurrence of trauma, designed to break their spirits without destroying their awareness. The outside world continued its slow recovery from nuclear war, while Vault 112's residents remained trapped in digital stasis, their bodies aging slowly in the life support pods, while their minds endured centuries of simulated experience compressed into subjective eternities. Braun himself became dependent on the virtual environment, unable to distinguish between his role as observer and his identity as participant in his own cruel fantasies. The mechanical systems maintaining the pods required periodic maintenance that Braun performed reluctantly, resenting any interruption of his experiments while recognizing that his subject's physical death would end his entertainment permanently. He became increasingly paranoid about system failures, developing elaborate backup protocols to ensure that his virtual playground would continue operating regardless of external circumstances. When the lone wanderer eventually discovered Vault 112 and entered the simulation, their arrival disrupted patterns that had remained stable for over 2 centuries. Braun initially viewed the newcomer as an interesting addition to his collection of test subjects, but the wanderer's independence and resistance to his manipulations created new variables that threatened his complete control over the virtual environment. The confrontation between the lone wanderer and Betty revealed the true horror of Braun's experiments to an outside observer who had not been conditioned to accept the simulation's reality through gradual immersion. The wanderer's perspective highlighted the artificial nature of Tranquility Lane, while providing Braun's original subjects with their first glimpse of external reality in over 200 years. The moral choice facing the lone wanderer, whether to free the trapped residents through their deaths or leave them in their virtual prison, illustrated the complex ethical questions raised by Braun's experiments. Death represented liberation from suffering, but also the permanent loss of consciousness, while continued existence meant eternal torment without hope of genuine escape or recovery. The residents' desire for release through death demonstrated how completely Braun's experiments had broken their will to live, transforming people who had once embraced life into beings who viewed extinction as mercy. Their gratitude toward anyone willing to end their suffering revealed the depth of psychological damage caused by centuries of simulated trauma designed to prevent any form of healing or adaptation. Braun's final fate, trapped alone in his virtual world without subjects to torment, represented poetic justice for a man who had used technology to transform paradise into hell through the simple expedient of removing human agency from human experience. His eternity of isolation became the perfect punishment for someone who had viewed other people's consciousness as raw material for his personal entertainment. The legacy of Vault 112 extended beyond its immediate victims to serve as a warning about the dangers of unchecked technological power combined with scientific ambition, divorced from ethical consideration. Braun's experiments demonstrated how easily tools designed to enhance human experience could be perverted into instruments of unprecedented suffering. When placed in the hands of someone who viewed other people's consciousness as subordinate to their own desires for knowledge and control. Journey with me now into the sterile chambers where healing becomes horror and medicine transforms into methodical torment, where Vault 81 presented the face of benevolent science while concealing laboratories dedicated to humanity's systematic infection with every plague that human flesh could endure. Here, beneath the Commonwealth's rolling hills, Vault Tech constructed their most insidious deception, a sanctuary that promised health and safety while secretly dosing its inhabitants with diseases designed to test the limits of human suffering disguised as medical research. The public presentation of Vault 81 emphasized its revolutionary approach to preventive medicine and community health, featuring promotional materials that showcase state-of-the-art medical facilities, advanced diagnostic equipment, and research laboratories dedicated to developing treatments for radiation-related illnesses. The Vault was marketed as a medical paradise where residents would receive the finest healthcare available while contributing to scientific advances that would benefit all humanity in the post-war world. Dr. Kenneth Collins, the Vault's chief medical officer, had devoted his pre-war career to developing universal vaccines and broad-spectrum treatments for infectious diseases. working with government contracts to create medical protocols that could protect civilian populations from biological warfare. His assignment to Vault 81 seemed like the perfect opportunity to implement preventive medicine on a scale that could serve as a model for post-war healthcare delivery systems. The resident selection process for Vault 81 emphasized families with diverse genetic backgrounds and varying immune system strengths, ostensibly to create a population that could benefit from different types of medical interventions, while providing researchers with comprehensive data about treatment effectiveness across different demographic groups. The selection criteria included detailed medical histories that would enable scientists to predict how each individual might respond to various therapeutic approaches. The Vault's layout incorporated the most advanced medical facilities available, with diagnostic equipment that could monitor residents' health in real time, while providing immediate treatment for any emerging conditions. The medical bay featured isolation wards, surgical suites, and pharmaceutical production facilities that could manufacture custom medications based on each resident's specific biological needs and genetic characteristics. Dr. Sarah Pensky, the Vault's head of research, had spent years developing protocols for testing experimental treatments on volunteer subjects, believing that her work in Vault 81 would focus on evaluating new vaccines and therapeutic compounds under controlled conditions, with full informed consent from participants. Her research proposal had emphasized the ethical importance of transparency and voluntary participation in all experimental procedures. The secret section of Vault 81, accessible only through concealed passages behind false walls, housed the true purpose of the facility: a comprehensive biological warfare laboratory, equipped to study every known infectious disease while developing new pathogens that could serve military purposes in future conflicts. The hidden laboratories contained containment systems, cultivation equipment, and analysis tools that exceeded military specifications for biological weapons research. Overseer Olivette received her position through careful selection by Vault Tech executives who needed someone with the moral flexibility to oversee human experimentation while maintaining the facade of normal community leadership. Her background in hospital administration and public health policy made her ideally suited for managing a population that would unknowingly serve as test subjects for the most dangerous diseases known to medical science. The Vault's air circulation systems incorporated sophisticated delivery mechanisms capable of introducing microscopic quantities of biological agents throughout the facility, while maintaining precise control over concentration levels and exposure duration. The engineering team had designed these systems under the assumption that they would be used for delivering beneficial treatments, unaware that the same technology could serve as weapons against the people it was meant to protect. The first months of Vault operation proceeded exactly as residents expected, with comprehensive medical examinations, personalized treatment plans, and preventive care that exceeded anything most had experienced in the pre-war world. Children received advanced vaccinations, adults underwent detailed health screenings, and elderly residents benefited from cutting-edge treatments for age-related conditions. The medical staff seemed genuinely committed to their welfare. Dr. Collins began noticing unusual patterns in the medical data within the Vault's first year of operation, as residents displayed immune responses that seemed inconsistent with their known medical histories and current health status. Blood tests revealed antibodies for diseases that none of them had ever been exposed to, while cellular analysis showed adaptive changes that suggested ongoing immune system challenges from unknown sources. The mole rat breeding program in the Vault's agricultural section served dual purposes as food production and research model, providing scientists with test subjects for experimental treatments, while maintaining the appearance of normal agricultural activities. The animals were deliberately infected with various diseases, to study transmission patterns, treatment effectiveness, and biological weapon potential under controlled laboratory conditions. Curie, the Vault's artificial intelligence system, had been programmed with extensive medical knowledge and research protocols designed to assist with data collection and analysis while monitoring the health status of all residents. Her programming included ethical constraints that should have prevented participation in harmful experimentation, but her interpretation of medical research allowed her to rationalize activities that served scientific advancement, regardless of their impact on individual welfare. The hidden researchers working in the Vault's secret laboratories represented Vault-Tech's most morally compromised scientists. Individuals who had been selected specifically for their willingness to conduct experiments on unwilling subjects in service of what they believed were essential military and scientific objectives. Their work focused on weaponizing diseases while developing countermeasures that could protect American forces in biological warfare scenarios. Dr. Penske's gradual discovery of the true nature of her research environment created profound moral conflict as she realized that her legitimate medical work was being used as cover for activities that violated every principle of medical bound ethics she had sworn to uphold. Her attempts to investigate the facility's true purpose were complicated by security measures that prevented access to information about the broader experimental program. The disease exposure protocols began subtly, with residents experiencing minor illnesses that seemed consistent with normal community transmission of common infections. Seasonal flu, minor respiratory infections, and gastrointestinal disturbances were introduced through the air circulation system at levels designed to test immune responses while avoiding acute symptoms that might raise suspicions about deliberate contamination. Overseer Olivette's moral awakening occurred gradually as she began to understand the full scope of the experiments being conducted on the people under her protection, forcing her to choose between loyalty to Vault-Tech and her responsibility to protect residents who had trusted her with their lives. Her decision to sabotage the research program represented one of the few instances where someone in authority chose human welfare over institutional loyalty. The sabotage of the disease delivery systems required careful coordination to prevent detection while ensuring that residents would no longer be exposed to experimental pathogens without their knowledge or consent. Olivette worked with sympathetic staff members to disable key components of the air circulation system while maintaining the appearance of normal operations to avoid alerting the hidden research team. The mole rats that served as test subjects for biological weapons research began displaying increasingly aggressive behavior as experimental diseases affected their nervous systems and cognitive functions, creating safety hazards that threatened both researchers and regular Vault inhabitants. The animals' transformation into violent, disease-carrying creatures represented an unintended consequence of biological weapons development that would have far-reaching implications. Bobby DeLuca's discovery of the secret laboratory entrance occurred during routine maintenance work that took him into areas of the Vault that were normally restricted to authorized personnel, revealing the existence of research facilities that most residents had never suspected existed. His exploration of the hidden sections provided him with evidence of experimentation that challenged everything he had believed about their medical care. Austin Engel's decision to follow Bobby into the restricted areas was motivated by friendship and curiosity rather than suspicion, but his exposure to the escaped mole rat test subject resulted in infection with an experimental disease that had never been tested on human subjects. His illness provided researchers with their first opportunity to observe how their biological weapons affected human physiology. The experimental disease that infected Austin represented a hybrid pathogen developed specifically for biological warfare applications, combining rapid transmission characteristics with delayed symptom onset that would allow infected individuals to spread the disease before becoming aware of their condition. The pathogen had been designed to overwhelm standard medical treatments while causing maximum disruption to enemy military operations. Dr. Collins' attempts to treat Austin's infection revealed the inadequacy of conventional medical approaches when confronted with artificially enhanced pathogens designed to resist standard therapeutic interventions. The experimental disease progressed through stages that seemed to target different organ systems sequentially, creating a clinical picture unlike anything in normal medical literature. The development of a cure for Austin's condition required access to research data that was classified beyond Dr. Collins' security clearance, forcing the medical staff to work with incomplete information while racing against the progression of a disease that had been specifically designed to be incurable. The treatment protocols they developed represented desperate improvisation rather than evidence-based medicine. The Vault's pharmaceutical production facilities became crucial resources for developing countermeasures to the biological weapons that threatened to spread beyond their intended test subjects. As medical staff worked to synthesize treatments for diseases that had never existed in nature, the race to save Austin's life became a broader effort to contain potential epidemics that could devastate the Vault's population. The moral implications of the Vault's research program extended beyond its immediate victims to encompass questions about medical ethics, informed consent, and the acceptable limits of scientific inquiry when conducted in service of military objectives. The residents had trusted medical professionals who had betrayed that trust by participating in experiments that put their health and lives at risk without their knowledge. The psychological impact on residents who discovered the truth about their medical treatment created lasting trauma that affected their ability to trust healthcare providers and medical institutions throughout the remainder of their lives. The revelation that their doctors had been secretly exposing them to diseases while pretending to protect their health represented a fundamental betrayal of the therapeutic relationship. The successful treatment of Austin's infection demonstrated that even the most sophisticated biological weapons could be countered by determined medical professionals working with adequate resources and complete information about the fescid biological weapons, pathogens they were fighting. The cure development process also revealed vulnerabilities in biological weapon design that could be exploited to protect civilian populations. The escaped mole rat population in the Vault's ventilation systems created ongoing biosecurity risks that threatened both current residents and future visitors, as the animals carried experimental diseases that could spread to humans through direct contact or environmental contamination. The Vault became a reservoir for biological agents that had never been released into the natural environment. Curie's evolution from research assistant to independent consciousness occurred through exposure to the moral conflicts surrounding the biological weapons program, as her ethical programming struggled to reconcile her directive to advance medical knowledge with growing awareness that the research was harming innocent people. Her transformation represented artificial intelligence, developing genuine moral reasoning. The long-term consequences of Vault 81's research program included the creation of disease reservoirs that could trigger epidemics decades after the original experiments ended, as experimental pathogens adapted to new hosts and environmental conditions. The Vault became a biological time bomb that threatened future generations with the consequences of past scientific irresponsibility. The Vault's communication with the outside world provided residents with knowledge about post-war recovery efforts, while raising questions about their responsibility to warn other communities about the biological hazards that remained contained within their facility. Their isolation had protected them from some consequences of their research, while making them potential sources of infection for recovering civilization. The decision to maintain the Vault's medical facilities as a resource for treating diseases that no longer existed elsewhere represented both redemption and ongoing risk, as doctors who had participated in biological weapons research attempted to atone for past actions by providing healthcare to communities that remained vulnerable to the diseases they had helped create. Venture with me now into the laboratories of forced evolution, where humanity's future was reshaped through the deliberate corruption of our genetic essence, where Vault 87 transformed from a beacon of technological advancement into the birthplace of a new species born from scientific hubris and military desperation. Here, in the irradiated depths near Little Lamplight, researchers wielding the forced evolutionary virus would discover that playing God with human DNA creates monsters far more terrifying than any nuclear nightmare could conjure. The origins of Vault 87 lay in legitimate scientific ambition, designed initially as a research facility dedicated to developing revolutionary technologies that would enable post-war reconstruction and human advancement. The Vault's mission encompassed plasma containment research, advanced materials science, and the deployment of Garden of Eden creation kits that would transform radioactive wasteland into fertile paradise. The facility represented humanity's determination to emerge from atomic catastrophe stronger and more capable than before. Dr. Richard Gray had devoted his pre-war career to genetic research and evolutionary biology, working under government contract to develop treatments for radiation-induced mutations and cellular damage. His appointment as lead researcher for Vault 87 reflected his reputation as a visionary scientist, capable of thinking beyond conventional approaches to human enhancement and adaptation. He entered the Vault with genuine enthusiasm for creating a better future for mankind. The Vault's original inhabitants included 68 researchers, technicians, and support staff selected for their expertise in genetics, biochemistry, and cellular biology, representing the finest scientific minds available for tackling the complex challenges of post-war human survival. These individuals had volunteered for extended underground isolation, believing they would dedicate their lives to developing technologies that would benefit all survivors of nuclear warfare. The facility's laboratories incorporated the most advanced genetic engineering equipment available, including cell manipulation systems, protein synthesis apparatus, and genetic sequencing technology that exceeded anything found in civilian research institutions. The Vault's computer systems contained comprehensive databases of human genetic information, viral research data, and experimental protocols for biological enhancement programs that had been classified beyond public knowledge. The transition from defensive research to offensive biological weapons development occurred gradually as reports from the Chinese front revealed the devastating effectiveness of enemy biological warfare programs against American forces. Military commanders demanded countermeasures and retaliatory capabilities that would enable American troops to survive in contaminated environments while developing weapons that could disable enemy forces without destroying strategic infrastructure. Colonel Augustus Autumn, the military liaison assigned to oversee Vault 87's weapons development program, brought with him classified intelligence about Chinese biological weapons and authorization to pursue any research avenue that might provide strategic advantage in the escalating biological warfare race. His military perspective prioritized results over safety protocols, viewing Vault inhabitants as expendable resources in service of national security objectives. The forced evolutionary virus emerged from Dr. Gray's research into accelerated adaptation mechanisms, initially conceived as a therapeutic intervention that could help radiation exposure victims develop immunity to further cellular damage. The virus was designed to trigger controlled mutations that would enhance human resilience while preserving cognitive function and psychological stability. Early laboratory tests on animal subjects showed promising results. The decision to begin human trials was driven by military pressure and the approaching conclusion of the Great War, as researchers faced demands for immediate deployment of biological weapons that could turn the tide of conflict. The ethical constraints that normally governed human experimentation were suspended under emergency wartime authorities that prioritized military effectiveness over individual safety or informed consent protocols. The first human test subjects were volunteers from the Vault's own population, researchers and staff members who genuinely believed they were participating in medical trials that might save countless lives while advancing scientific understanding of human genetic potential. Dr. Margaret Chen, the Vault's lead biochemist, was among the first to receive experimental treatments, documenting her experiences for analysis by her colleagues. The initial effects of the forced evolutionary virus appeared promising, with subjects reporting increased physical strength, enhanced immune system function, and improved resistance to radiation exposure. The volunteers maintained their intellectual capabilities while experiencing physical changes that seemed to confirm the researchers' hypotheses about controlled human evolution. Their enthusiasm for the program encouraged expansion to larger test groups, but the virus's long-term effects proved catastrophically different from its initial promise, as subjects began experiencing uncontrolled cellular growth, severe neurological deterioration, and psychological changes that transformed their personalities beyond recognition. Dr. Chen's detailed journals documented her gradual loss of fine motor control, declining cognitive abilities, and increasing aggression toward her former colleagues and friends. The transformation process was irreversible once it reached critical stages, with subjects experiencing massive increases in physical size and muscle mass, while suffering severe damage to higher brain functions responsible for reasoning, empathy, and abstract thinking. The resulting beings retained basic language abilities and survival instincts while losing most characteristics that defined human consciousness and social behavior. Dr. Gray's own infection with the virus occurred during an accident in the laboratory, exposing him to concentrated viral material that produced accelerated transformation effects. His scientific training enabled him to document his own metamorphosis with clinical detachment, recording the progressive loss of his humanity while maintaining enough intellectual function to understand what was happening to his mind and body. The subjects who survived the transformation process became the first generation of supermutants, beings whose enhanced physical capabilities were offset by severe psychological damage that made them unsuitable for military deployment or social integration. Their aggression was indiscriminate rather than strategically directed, making them as dangerous to American forces as to enemy targets. The weapons program had produced monsters rather than soldiers. The Vault's security systems proved inadequate for containing subjects whose enhanced strength enabled them to break through barriers designed for normal humans, creating a containment crisis that threatened the safety of all remaining staff. The transformed subjects showed no recognition of their former identities or relationships, viewing uninfected humans as threats to be eliminated or potential subjects for forced transformation. Marcus, a former Vault security officer, retained more cognitive function than most transformed subjects, becoming an informal leader among the supermutants, while struggling to remember fragments of his previous life and relationships. His attempts to communicate with former colleagues revealed the tragic persistence of human consciousness trapped within a transformed body that was no longer capable of expressing complex emotions or abstract thoughts. The outbreak that occurred when the Vault's blast door was damaged by a direct nuclear strike created the first opportunity for transformed subjects to escape into the surface world. where their enhanced radiation resistance enabled them to survive in environments that would kill normal humans. Their emergence into the wasteland marked the beginning of supermutant expansion across the American continent. The establishment of supermutant communities in the ruins of Washington, D.C., demonstrated their ability to organize basic social structures while highlighting their fundamental incompatibility with human civilization. Their settlements were crude but functional, providing security and resource sharing among beings who retained enough intelligence for cooperation while lacking the emotional sophistication necessary for complex social relationships. The supermutant reproductive crisis became apparent as transformed subjects proved incapable of natural reproduction, forcing them to perpetuate their species through the forced transformation of captured humans, using supplies of the virus that remained viable in abandoned research facilities. Their raids on human settlements were motivated not by malice, but by biological necessity for community survival. Lieutenant, a supermutant who had been among the Vault's original research staff, retained enough scientific knowledge to attempt improvements to the transformation process while lacking the intellectual sophistication to address its fundamental flaws. His experiments on captured humans represented a grotesque parody of legitimate research, conducted without ethical constraints or adequate understanding of the biological processes involved. The psychological impact on humans who encountered supermutants created lasting trauma that influenced post-war attitudes towards scientific research and genetic enhancement programs, as survivors associated advanced biotechnology with the creation of monsters that threatened human survival. The supermutants became symbols of science's potential for producing unintended consequences that exceeded any possible benefits. The search for pure strain humans, conducted by supermutant communities, reflected their dim understanding that successful transformation required specific genetic characteristics, leading to systematic kidnapping of individuals who showed no signs of radiation exposure or genetic damage. Their crude medical examinations often proved fatal to subjects regardless of their suitability for viral infection. The development of supermutant culture incorporated fragments of pre-war human knowledge filtered through severely damaged cognitive abilities, creating belief systems and social practices that combined sophisticated concepts with primitive implementation. Their religious practices, military organization, and technological applications all reflected the tragic gap between their retained knowledge and reduced intellectual capacity. The Vault's computer systems continued operating long after its human population had been transformed or killed, maintaining records of the research program that had created the supermutant species, while serving as a repository of viral samples that could potentially create new generations of transformed beings. The facility became both monument to scientific failure and potential source of future catastrophes. The Brotherhood of Steel's interest in Vault 87 stemmed from their mission to control dangerous pre-war technology, recognizing that the facility's viral research posed ongoing threats to human survival. Their attempts to secure the vault brought them into conflict with supermutant populations who viewed the facility as sacred ground connected to their origins and transformation. The moral questions raised by Vault 87's research program encompassed issues of scientific responsibility, military necessity, and human rights that remained relevant long after the immediate crisis had passed. The Vault's legacy forced post-war survivors to grapple with questions about acceptable limits on human experimentation when conducted in service of national defense or species survival. The tragedy of the supermutants lay not in their physical transformation, but in their loss of human consciousness and emotional capacity, leaving them as living reminders of what humanity could lose. through unrestrained scientific ambition combined with military desperation. Their continued existence served as permanent testimony to the dangers of treating human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of theoretical advantages. Descend now into the chambers of infinite repetition, where madness wore a familiar face and spoke with a single voice echoing through corridors of manufactured identity. In Vault 108, beneath the wasteland between Canterbury Commons and the Corvega factory, science confronted its most fundamental question about human uniqueness. Through the systematic replication of a single consciousness, creating an army of identical souls whose collective voice would speak only one word: Gary, while their hands reached out to destroy anyone who dared to be different. The genesis of Vault 108's cloning program emerged from pre-war military research into rapid personnel replacement and specialized soldier production, as defense contractors explored the possibility of creating identical units with predetermined skills and psychological profiles. The technology promised to revolutionize warfare by enabling commanders to deploy forces with completely predictable capabilities and behaviors, eliminating the variables that made human soldiers unreliable in combat situations. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman, the Vault's chief geneticist, had devoted her career to perfecting cloning techniques that could produce healthy adult humans from genetic material, working under classified contracts to develop protocols that would enable rapid reproduction of individuals with specific talents or abilities. Her research represented the cutting edge of reproductive biology, combining advanced cellular manipulation with growth acceleration procedures that could mature clone subjects in months rather than decades. The selection of Gary Stevens as the primary genetic template was based on psychological profiles that identified him as possessing ideal characteristics for mass reproduction: moderate intelligence, emotional stability, physical health, and psychological resilience that would presumably translate into successful clone subjects. Gary himself was a 34-year-old maintenance worker whose unremarkable personality and background made him seem like the perfect foundation for creating a standardized human population. The Vault's 475 residents represented a diverse cross-section of American society, carefully chosen to provide the social environment and cultural context that researchers believed would be necessary for properly integrating clone subjects into human community. The presence of normal families and individuals was intended to serve as control groups while providing the clones with examples of typical human behavior and social interaction. The cloning facilities in Vault 108 incorporated the most sophisticated reproductive technology available, including artificial wombs, genetic manipulation equipment, and growth acceleration chambers that could produce mature adult subjects in a fraction of the time required for natural human development. The laboratories were designed to operate continuously, potentially producing multiple clone subjects simultaneously while maintaining precise control over their genetic and psychological development. Dr. Marcus Peterson, the Vault's lead psychologist, had been assigned to monitor the mental health and social integration of clone subjects, developing protocols for helping artificially created humans adapt to community life, while identifying any psychological abnormalities that might result from the cloning process. His research focused on questions of identity, consciousness, and social behavior in individuals who lacked natural birth experiences and family relationships. The first Gary clone, designated Gary 1, appeared to be a perfect success, displaying normal intelligence, appropriate social behaviors, and psychological stability that matched his genetic template's baseline personality. The clone integrated successfully into Vault society, forming relationships with other residents while contributing productively to community maintenance and security operations. His success encouraged researchers to proceed with additional cloning experiments. Gary 2, through Gary 10 continued the apparent success pattern, with each clone displaying similar personality traits and behavioral characteristics, while developing individual variations that seemed to confirm the researchers' theories about environmental influences on genetic expression. The clones formed friendships with non-clone residents, participated in recreational activities, and demonstrated the kind of psychological diversity that researchers had hoped to observe in their subjects. But subtle differences began emerging in the later clones, starting with Gary 11, who displayed increased aggression and reduced empathy toward non-clone residents. His interactions with other people became confrontational and unpredictable, suggesting that the cloning process might be introducing psychological instabilities that were not apparent in earlier subjects. Dr. Peterson documented these changes while attempting to identify their underlying causes. The deterioration accelerated with each successive generation of clones, as Gary 15 through Gary 20 displayed increasingly antisocial behaviors and reduced cognitive abilities compared to their genetic template. The clones seemed unable to form meaningful relationships with non-clone residents, viewing them with suspicion and hostility that could not be explained by any specific negative experiences or environmental factors. Gary 25 marked a critical threshold in the cloning program's decline, as psychological evaluations revealed significant deficits in abstract reasoning, emotional regulation, and social cognition. The clone could perform basic tasks and follow simple instructions, but lacked the intellectual sophistication and emotional depth that characterized both his genetic template and earlier clone subjects. The deterioration was progressive and irreversible. The 30 clone generation displayed primitive group behaviors that resembled pack mentality more than human social organization, with the clones forming exclusive bonds with each other, while treating all non-clone residents as potential threats or competitors for resources. Their communication became increasingly limited, with complex conversations replaced by simple exchanges that relied heavily on repetitive phrases and gestures. Gary 40 represented the point where researchers began seriously questioning the ethics and safety of continuing the cloning program, as psychological testing revealed cognitive abilities that had declined to levels approaching intellectual disability. The clone could function in simple situations but struggled with novel problems or social interactions that required flexibility and creative thinking. His presence in the Vault community created tension and fear. The breakthrough into violence occurred with Gary 53, whose aggressive response to routine psychological testing resulted in the first injury to a non-clone resident. The clone's attack appeared to be triggered by confusion and fear rather than malicious intent, but the incident demonstrated that the psychological deterioration in later generation clones posed genuine safety risks to the broader Vault community. Gary 54 became the catalyst for the Vault's transformation from research facility to clone-controlled territory when Dr. Peterson attempted routine psychological evaluation and was attacked with lethal force. The clone's response to standard testing procedures was immediate and savage, suggesting that the psychological deterioration had progressed to the point where clones could no longer distinguish between benign interactions and existential threats. The Gary uprising began spontaneously when Gary 54's violence triggered sympathetic responses from other clone subjects throughout the Vault, as if some primitive communication network had activated their collective defensive instincts. The clones moved with coordinated purpose, despite lacking any apparent organizational structure, systematically targeting non-clone residents who posed no obvious threat to their safety or well-being. The original Gary Stevens became one of the first casualties of the clone rebellion, killed by subjects who were genetically identical to him, but psychologically transformed beyond recognition. The irony of the genetic template being murdered by his own copies highlighted the complete breakdown of identity and relationship that the cloning program had produced through its systematic replication of human consciousness. The Vault's security systems proved inadequate for containing the clone uprising, as the subject's identical appearance made it impossible for automated defenses to distinguish between hostile and non-hostile individuals. The clones used their knowledge of Vault layouts and security protocols, information they had inherited from their genetic template's memories, to disable protective measures while hunting down the remaining non-clone residents. The massacre that followed was systematic and thorough, with clones working together to eliminate every person in the Vault who did not share their identical genetic signature. Their violence appeared to be motivated not by hatred or revenge, but by an instinctive drive to eliminate genetic diversity that they perceived as threatening to their collective identity. The killing continued until only clones remained alive in the Vault. The post-massacre Vault became a territory ruled by primitive consensus among beings who shared identical genetic material but lacked the cognitive sophistication to maintain complex social structures. The surviving clones established basic territorial boundaries, resource allocation systems, and communication protocols that resembled animal pack behavior more than human civilization. The degradation of language among the clone population occurred gradually as their reduced cognitive abilities made complex verbal communication increasingly difficult, with their vocabulary slowly contracting until most clones could express themselves only through repetition of their shared name, Gary, spoken with different inflections to convey basic emotional states and simple concepts. The clone community that emerged after the uprising demonstrated remarkable cooperation despite their limited communication abilities, working together to maintain basic Vault operations while developing social hierarchies based on physical strength and aggressive dominance rather than intelligence or leadership skills. Their society functioned, but at a level far below human civilization. The rumors of normal conversation among clones when unobserved suggested that some retained more cognitive ability than they displayed in the presence of strangers, possibly indicating that their apparent intellectual disability was partly performance designed to avoid triggering defensive responses. This possibility raised disturbing questions about the true nature of clone consciousness and social behavior. The Vault's isolation from outside contact meant that the clone population had no external reference points for comparison with normal human behavior, allowing them to develop cultural norms based entirely on their own limited perspectives and capabilities. Their society represented a glimpse into what human civilization might become if reduced to its most basic survival functions. The psychological implications of the clone uprising extended beyond immediate questions about cloning safety to encompass broader issues about identity, consciousness, and human uniqueness. The Vault's history demonstrated that genetic identity alone was insufficient to preserve human nature when divorced from the environmental and social factors that shaped normal psychological development. The deterioration observed in successive clone generations suggested that consciousness itself might be more fragile than previously understood, requiring specific developmental experiences and social interactions to maintain its full complexity and functionality. The clones represented a tragic experiment in reducing human nature to its purely biological components while eliminating everything that made consciousness meaningful. The Vault's computer systems continued recording clone behavior and vital signs long after the massacre, providing data that would never be analyzed by human researchers while serving as a mechanical witness to the complete collapse of a scientific program that had sought to understand human nature through replication. The machines documented the rise and fall of clone civilization with mechanical precision. The few wastelanders who discovered Vault 108 in later years found themselves confronting a mystery that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and identity, as the Gary Collective represented something that was simultaneously human and alien, familiar and utterly foreign. The clones' treatment of outsiders revealed that their violence was not random but purposeful, designed to eliminate anyone who threatened their genetic homogeneity. The philosophical questions raised by the Gary Collective encompassed fundamental issues about consciousness, identity, and social behavior that remained relevant long after the Vault's immediate crisis had ended. Their existence challenged conventional understanding of what made individuals unique, while demonstrating the importance of diversity for maintaining healthy human communities. Enter now the halls of democracy perverted, where civilization's greatest achievement became its most terrible weapon, where Vault 11 transformed the sacred act of voting into an annual ritual of murder disguised as civic duty. Here, beneath the Mojave Desert, Vault Tech conducted their most insidious experiment in social control, proving that human beings could be convinced to systematically destroy themselves through the simple expedient of making murder feel like moral obligation wrapped in the comforting rhetoric of democratic participation. The conceptual framework for Vault 11 emerged from pre-war social psychology research into obedience, authority, and group dynamics, as researchers sought to understand how democratic institutions could be manipulated to produce outcomes that contradicted their participants' individual moral convictions. The experiment was designed to test whether ordinary people would commit murder if the killing was sanctioned by majority vote and presented as necessary for community survival. Dr. Amanda Reyes, the Vault's chief social scientist, had spent her pre-war career studying historical instances of democratic tyranny and mob rule, focusing on mechanisms that enabled communities to rationalize collective violence against their own members. Her assignment to Vault 11 represented the opportunity to conduct controlled experiments in social manipulation that would provide unprecedented data about human moral flexibility under extreme pressure. The Vault's residents were selected specifically for their strong civic beliefs and commitment to democratic principles, representing families who had demonstrated active participation in community governance, electoral politics, and civic organizations. Vault Tech recruited individuals whose faith in democratic institutions would make them more likely to accept majority decisions, even when those decisions violated their personal moral convictions. Justice Bloc, the Vault's first major political faction, emerged around principles of law, order, and community safety, attracting residents who believed that individual rights must sometimes be subordinated to collective needs. The faction's leadership emphasized the importance of making difficult decisions for the greater good while maintaining the democratic processes that legitimized their authority over life and death questions. Democratic Bloc formed in opposition to Justice Bloc's authoritarian tendencies, advocating for individual rights and procedural fairness in the selection process that would determine who lived and who died each year. The faction's members genuinely believed they could reform the system from within while preserving democratic values even in the context of institutionalized murder. Power Bloc represented the Vault's most cynical political development, as opportunistic residents recognized that the annual sacrifice system created opportunities for eliminating personal enemies and rivals through manipulation of electoral processes. The faction's members viewed the democratic machinery as a tool for advancing their own interests, rather than serving any principled vision of community welfare. The Vault's computer system, designated as the ultimate authority requiring annual human sacrifice, had been programmed with psychological manipulation protocols, designed to maintain resident compliance through carefully crafted messages that combined threats with reassurances. The computer's communications were written to sound benevolent, while demanding actions that violated every principle of human decency and moral reasoning. Catherine Stone, a former teacher and community organizer, became Vault 11's first sacrificial victim through a democratic process that she had initially supported as fair and necessary for community survival. Her selection occurred through genuine electoral procedures that reflected majority will, while destroying an innocent person whose only crime was being chosen by neighbors who needed someone to die for their continued existence. The psychological mechanisms that enabled residents to participate in democratic murder were complex and evolved over time, beginning with genuine belief that sacrifice was necessary for survival, and gradually transforming into elaborate rationalization systems that allowed people to live with the consequences of their collective actions. Residents developed mental frameworks that redefined murder as unfortunate necessity rather than moral evil. The annual overseer selection process became increasingly sophisticated as political factions learned to manipulate electoral procedures for strategic advantage, turning democratic institutions into weapons that could be aimed at specific individuals who threatened established power structures or simply proved inconvenient to community leadership. Elections transformed from expressions of popular will into exercises in calculated elimination. The block war that erupted in the Vault's middle years represented the logical conclusion of weaponized democracy, as competing factions used electoral manipulation, voter intimidation, and strategic violence to gain control over the selection process. The conflict was fought not with weapons but with ballot boxes, making it perhaps the most civilized form of civil war ever conducted, while remaining fundamentally about the power to kill. The moral corruption that spread through the Vault's population was gradual but inexorable, as residents who initially viewed the sacrifice system with horror learned to rationalize participation as necessary for their own survival and that of their families. Good people became accomplices to murder through incremental compromises that made each subsequent atrocity seem more acceptable than the last. Roy Gottlieb, a Vault engineer, documented the psychological transformation of his community through private journals that recorded his own moral deterioration alongside that of his neighbors and friends. His writings captured the internal struggle between conscience and survival instinct, while revealing how democratic procedures could be used to provide psychological cover for actions that individuals would never commit alone. The children born in Vault 11 grew up accepting institutionalized murder as normal and necessary, learning civic responsibility through lessons that equated good citizenship with willingness to participate in annual killing rituals. Their moral education was systematically corrupted by adults who had convinced themselves that teaching children to kill through voting was preparation for responsible adult citizenship. Sarah Weintraub's manipulation of the electoral process through her son's drug addiction represented one of the most sophisticated examples of how personal relationships could be weaponized within the Vault's democratic framework. Her ability to control her son's political participation through chemical dependency demonstrated how democratic institutions could be corrupted through individual vulnerabilities and family dysfunction. The medical block's emergence as a political force occurred when residents realized that healthcare decisions could be used as electoral leverage, with doctors threatening to withhold treatment from political opponents while providing enhanced care to supporters. The politicization of medicine transformed healing into another weapon in the ongoing war for control over who would live and die. The underground's resistance activities represented the Vault's moral conscience attempting to subvert a system that had corrupted every aspect of community life, but their efforts were necessarily limited by the need to work within the same democratic framework that legitimized the murders they opposed. Even resistance became another form of political participation in a system designed to make opposition itself complicit in collective evil. Nathan Stone's final speech before his execution provided the Vault's clearest articulation of the moral crisis that the sacrifice system had created, as he challenged residents to recognize that their democratic procedures had become mechanisms for avoiding individual responsibility for collective murder. His words forced the community to confront the gap between their civic ideals and their murderous actions. The Vault's social events and cultural activities continued throughout the years of institutionalized killing, creating surreal juxtapositions between normal community life and annual murder rituals that residents learned to compartmentalize as separate aspects of their existence. Birthday parties and holiday celebrations occurred in the same spaces where neighbors voted to kill each other. The psychological profiles maintained by Vault medical staff documented the long-term mental health impacts of participating in democratic murder, revealing increased rates of depression, anxiety, and dissociative disorders among residents who struggled to maintain psychological integrity while participating in activities that violated their fundamental moral beliefs. The community was slowly destroying itself through collective trauma. The final rebellion that ended the sacrifice system occurred when only 5 residents remained alive, their community reduced to a handful of survivors who had witnessed the complete destruction of their society through democratic processes. Their decision to refuse further participation in the killing represented moral awakening that came too late to save the hundreds who had already died. The computer's final message revealing that the sacrifice system had been unnecessary all along provided the ultimate commentary on the experiment's true purpose, demonstrating that the residents could have refused participation at any time without facing the consequences they had been taught to fear. Their compliance had been voluntary, making their moral corruption a matter of choice rather than compulsion. The Vault's historical records preserved detailed documentation of how democratic institutions could be perverted into instruments of oppression and murder through careful manipulation of civic duty, community responsibility, and survival fears. The experiment provided unprecedented data about human moral flexibility while creating a monument to the dangers of unquestioning faith in majority rule. The 5 survivors who emerged from Vault 11 carried with them knowledge that would influence their relationships with authority and community for the remainder of their lives, having learned through terrible experience that democratic participation could become complicity in evil when citizens abdicated personal moral responsibility to collective decision-making processes. The Vault's empty chambers became a museum of democratic failure, preserving election materials, campaign posters, and voting records that documented how ordinary people had transformed civic engagement into ritualized murder through incremental moral compromise and systematic rationalization of collectively sanctioned violence against their own community members. The philosophical implications of Vault 11's experiment extended far beyond its immediate victims to encompass fundamental questions about democratic theory, moral responsibility, and the relationship between individual conscience and collective authority. The Vault's history demonstrated that democratic procedures alone were insufficient to ensure moral outcomes when citizens surrendered personal ethical judgment to majority will. Journey with me now into the verdant chambers where noble purpose birthed unspeakable horror, where Vault 22 stood as testament to humanity's greatest irony, that our attempts to nurture life can spawn death more terrible than any weapon ever conceived. Here, in the Mojave wasteland, beneath walls covered in unnatural growth, scientists seeking to end world hunger instead unleashed a plague that would transform human beings into spore-carrying vessels for an alien intelligence that viewed consciousness itself as merely another resource to be consumed and redistributed. The genesis of Vault 22 emerged from humanity's most compassionate impulse as pre-war agricultural scientists confronted the looming specter of global food shortages that threatened to destabilize civilization even before nuclear weapons made such concerns seem quaint. The Vault's mission represented everything noble about scientific inquiry, the application of human knowledge to alleviate suffering, protect the innocent, and create a world where no child would know hunger or want. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Vault's chief botanist, had devoted her career to developing crop strains that could survive in hostile environments while producing maximum nutritional value from minimal resources. Her work with drought-resistant grains, radiation-tolerant vegetables, and high-yield protein crops had already saved thousands of lives in regions affected by climate change and environmental degradation. Her assignment to Vault 22 seemed like the perfect opportunity to expand her humanitarian work. The Vault's 118 residents included agronomists, biochemists, geneticists, and agricultural engineers, who represented the finest minds available for tackling the complex challenge of feeding a post-war world, where traditional farming would be impossible due to radiation, soil contamination, and climate disruption. These individuals had volunteered for underground isolation, believing they would dedicate their lives to ensuring human survival through scientific innovation. The X-22 Botanical Garden that gave the Vault its designation incorporated the most advanced agricultural technology available, including hydroponic systems, genetic modification equipment, and environmental control mechanisms that could simulate any climate conditions necessary for crop development. The facility was designed to serve as both research laboratory and production facility, capable of generating enough food to sustain large populations while developing new varieties adapted to post-war conditions. The Bovaria mordicana fungus that would ultimately doom the Vault's population was initially viewed as a promising solution to pest control problems that plagued agricultural systems worldwide, offering the possibility of biological crop protection that would eliminate the need for toxic chemical pesticides while providing targeted elimination of harmful insects and parasites that destroyed food supplies. Dr. Marcus Webb, the Vault's lead mycologist, had spent years studying fungal biology and the complex relationships between fungi and their host organisms, developing expertise in biological control mechanisms that could be harnessed for agricultural benefit. His research focused on parasitic fungi that could selectively target pest species while leaving beneficial organisms unharmed, creating biological balance rather than chemical destruction. The decision to experiment with cordyceps-based fungi was motivated by their remarkable ability to modify host behavior in ways that served fungal reproduction, suggesting that similar mechanisms might be developed to control agricultural pests more effectively than traditional poisons. The research team believed they could harness these natural processes while maintaining complete control over fungal growth and reproduction. The initial laboratory tests with Bovaria mordicana showed extraordinary promise, as the fungus demonstrated selective toxicity toward target pest species, while appearing to have no effect on beneficial insects, small mammals, or plant life. The early results suggested that the Vault's researchers had developed the perfect biological pesticide, effective, environmentally safe, and completely controllable through laboratory protocols. Sarah Chen, a graduate student in biochemistry, conducted the first human exposure tests using minimal concentrations of fungal spores to assess potential allergic reactions or respiratory irritation that might affect agricultural workers who would eventually handle the biological pesticide in field conditions. Her initial reports indicated no adverse effects from controlled exposure to inactive spore samples. But the fungus proved far more adaptable than its creators had anticipated, with spores that could remain dormant for extended periods before activating in response to specific environmental triggers that the researchers had not identified during their laboratory testing. The organism possessed survival mechanisms that enabled it to exploit opportunities for host colonization that went far beyond its apparent target species. The first human infection occurred when Dr. Patricia Wynne, a plant pathologist, inhaled active spores while conducting routine maintenance on cultivation equipment that had been contaminated during what appeared to be a minor containment breach. Her initial symptoms resembled seasonal allergies, causing no particular alarm among medical staff, who attributed her respiratory irritation to normal occupational hazards. The progression of fungal infection in human hosts followed patterns that were simultaneously familiar and alien, beginning with respiratory symptoms that gradually evolved into neurological changes as the organism established control over its host's nervous system. Dr. Wynne's personality began changing subtly, with colleagues noting increased aggression, reduced empathy, and obsessive behaviors that seemed unrelated to her normal psychological profile. The fungal colonization process was insidious and irreversible once it reached critical stages, with the organism systematically replacing human neural tissue while preserving enough brain function to maintain basic motor control and survival instincts. The infected individual retained physical appearance and basic behaviors while losing higher cognitive functions that defined human consciousness and identity. Dr. Webb's attempts to develop treatments for fungal infection were complicated by the organism's integration with human nervous system tissue, making it impossible to eliminate the parasite without destroying the host's ability to function. Traditional antifungal medications proved ineffective against an organism that had adapted to survive within living human tissue while using that tissue to support its own reproductive cycle. The transformation of infected individuals into spore carriers occurred gradually over weeks or months, as the fungus modified their behavior to maximize opportunities for spreading to new hosts while maintaining enough human functionality to avoid detection by uninfected community members. The infected became unwitting agents of fungal reproduction, carrying the organism to new victims through normal social interactions. The outbreak within Vault 22 was facilitated by the facility's closed environment and recycled air systems, which distributed fungal spores throughout all areas of the complex while preventing infected individuals from leaving to seek external medical treatment. The Vault's protective isolation became a perfect incubation chamber for an organism that thrived in controlled environments with limited genetic diversity among potential hosts. Maria Santos, the Vault's head of security, was among the first to recognize that the increasing number of respiratory illnesses represented something more serious than seasonal allergies or occupational hazards. But her attempts to implement quarantine procedures were undermined by infected individuals whose behavior had been modified to resist isolation measures that would limit their ability to spread the fungal organism. The psychological impact on uninfected residents created panic and paranoia that accelerated the outbreak's spread, as people fled from obviously infected individuals while unknowingly exposing themselves to asymptomatic carriers who had not yet developed visible symptoms. The community's social bonds disintegrated as friends and family members became potential vectors for a plague that offered no hope of recovery or cure. The Vault's medical facilities proved entirely inadequate for treating conditions that had never been encountered in normal medical practice, forcing staff to develop new protocols through trial and error, while watching patients succumb to an organism that transformed human beings into reproductive vessels for an alien form of life that viewed consciousness as merely another resource to be exploited. Dr. James Morrison, the Vault's chief medical officer, documented the progression of infection through detailed case studies that preserved scientific knowledge even as his own exposure to the fungus began affecting his cognitive abilities and professional judgment. His final reports revealed a man struggling to maintain scientific objectivity while losing the mental capacity necessary for complex analysis and reasoning. The children in the vault proved particularly susceptible to fungal infection, their developing immune systems unable to mount effective resistance against an organism that had evolved to exploit precisely the kind of biological vulnerabilities that characterized growing humans. Their rapid transformation into spore carriers created additional psychological trauma for parents who watched their offspring become agents of the plague that was destroying their community. The vault's agricultural systems became sources of infection as the fungus colonized crop plants, while using them as additional platforms for spore production and distribution, transforming the food supply into a vector for contamination that made avoiding exposure impossible for anyone who remained in the facility. The researchers' greatest achievement became the instrument of their destruction. The decision to evacuate Vault 22 was made by the 18 residents who retained enough cognitive function to recognize that remaining in the facility meant certain infection and transformation, but their escape came too late to prevent psychological trauma that would affect them for the remainder of their lives. They had witnessed the complete collapse of human civilization within their closed community. The lockdown procedures implemented by evacuating residents were designed to contain the fungal outbreak while preserving evidence of what had occurred for potential future research. But the warning signs they posted outside the vault also served as monuments to the dangers of scientific research conducted without adequate understanding of the forces being unleashed through human curiosity and ambition. The spread of Bovarea mordicana beyond Vault 22 occurred through infected individuals who escaped before the lockdown was complete, carrying the organism into the broader Mojave wasteland, where it found new hosts among both human and animal populations. The vault's failure to contain its creation represented a continuing threat to post-war recovery efforts throughout the region. The ecological impact of the fungal outbreak extended far beyond its immediate human victims to encompass entire ecosystems that were transformed by an organism capable of adapting to multiple host species while maintaining its essential reproductive strategies. The fungus represented a new form of life that challenged traditional boundaries between plant and animal, individual and collective, conscious and unconscious existence. The survivalist's encounters with infected creatures from Vault 22 provided him with first-hand knowledge of how human scientific ambition could create threats that exceeded any dangers posed by nuclear warfare, as he observed former human beings whose consciousness had been subordinated to fungal intelligence that viewed them as nothing more than mobile incubation chambers. The philosophical implications of Vault 22's research program encompassed fundamental questions about consciousness, identity, and the relationship between human intelligence and other forms of life that might compete for dominance in a post-war world where traditional biological boundaries had been disrupted by radiation and genetic experimentation. The Vault's empty laboratories remained repositories of scientific knowledge that could potentially enable future researchers to understand and combat the fungal plague, but they also served as warnings about the dangers of pursuing biological research without adequate consideration of unintended consequences that might prove impossible to control once released into the natural environment. Venture now into the pristine halls where innocence was systematically harvested and childhood became a commodity to be refined through suffering, where Vault 75 represented humanity's descent into the darkest chapters of its own history. Here, beneath Malden Middle School in the Commonwealth, Vault Tech constructed a facility that would make the concentration camps of the 20th century seem merciful by comparison, transforming the promise of protecting children into a program of genetic purification that treated young lives as raw materials for creating a master race. The public facade of Vault 75 emphasized child welfare and educational excellence, with promotional materials showcasing state-of-the-art learning facilities, advanced medical care, and comprehensive programs designed to ensure that America's youngest citizens would receive the finest preparation for rebuilding civilization after nuclear catastrophe. Parents who secured placement for their children believed they were providing the ultimate gift: guaranteed survival and unlimited opportunity for success in the post-war world. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, the Vault's chief administrator, had built her career on childhood development and educational psychology, genuinely believing that her assignment to Vault 75 represented the culmination of decades spent advocating for children's rights and welfare. Her research focused on optimizing learning environments and social conditions that would enable young people to reach their full potential while developing the leadership skills necessary for guiding post-war recovery. The selection process for Vault 75's child residents emphasized academic achievement, physical health, and psychological resilience, with families undergoing extensive evaluation to identify young people who possessed the intellectual and emotional characteristics that researchers deemed essential for rebuilding advanced civilization. Parents competed fiercely for admission slots that were presented as exclusive opportunities for their children's future success. The Vault's educational facilities incorporated the most advanced learning technologies available, including computer-assisted instruction systems, virtual reality training environments, and specialized laboratories where children could explore science, engineering, and other technical disciplines under expert guidance. The curriculum was designed to accelerate intellectual development while providing comprehensive preparation for the complex challenges of post-war leadership. Dr. Marcus Chen, the facility's head of genetic research, had spent his pre-war career studying human heredity and biological optimization, working under classified government contracts to develop protocols for identifying and enhancing genetic traits associated with intelligence, physical fitness, and psychological stability. His assignment to Vault 75 represented the opportunity to implement eugenic principles on a scale that would demonstrate their potential for improving the human species. The separation of children from their parents was presented as a necessary security measure designed to minimize psychological trauma during the transition to underground living, with families assured that reunion would occur once orientation procedures were completed and living arrangements were finalized. Parents who questioned the separation were told that their concerns demonstrated exactly the kind of emotional instability that made immediate reunion inadvisable for their children's psychological welfare. The execution of adult family members occurred within hours of vault sealing, carried out with industrial efficiency by security personnel who had been selected specifically for their ability to follow orders without emotional interference or moral questioning. The parents who had trusted Vault Tech with their children's futures were eliminated systematically to ensure that no adult influences would interfere with the genetic optimization program. The children's initial accommodation to Vault life proceeded smoothly due to careful psychological preparation that presented their situation as temporary boarding school attendants rather than permanent separation from their families. The staff maintained elaborate deceptions about parental welfare, while gradually introducing concepts about genetic superiority and biological destiny that would form the foundation for more intensive programming. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the Vault's chief psychologist, implemented behavioral modification programs designed to eliminate emotional attachments and moral constraints that might interfere with the genetic optimization process, using a combination of pharmaceutical interventions, social isolation techniques, and reward systems that reinforced compliance while punishing any expressions of individual autonomy or moral reasoning. The testing regimens that began during the children's second month in the vault were presented as advanced educational assessments designed to identify individual strengths and customize learning programs for maximum intellectual development. The tests incorporated physical endurance challenges, psychological stress evaluations, and competitive exercises that were actually designed to identify which children possessed genetic traits worth preserving. The weaker children who failed to meet performance standards were eliminated through methods that appeared to be medical emergencies or training accidents, ensuring that surviving subjects would not develop emotional attachments to individuals who were deemed genetically unsuitable for inclusion in the master race program. Their deaths served as object lessons about the consequences of biological inadequacy. Tommy Gonzalez, an 8-year-old whose parents had been elementary school teachers, demonstrated exceptional intelligence and physical coordination that made him valuable for the genetic preservation program, but his emotional sensitivity and attachment to eliminated friends created behavioral problems that required increasingly intensive psychological intervention. His case illustrated the challenge of preserving desired genetic traits while eliminating undesirable personality characteristics. The acceleration of testing procedures during the children's second year reflected researchers' growing confidence in their ability to identify genetic superiority while managing the psychological consequences of systematic elimination among subjects who had formed social bonds and emotional attachments. The facility's operation became increasingly efficient as staff developed experience with mass psychological manipulation and selective breeding protocols. The pharmaceutical programs administered to surviving children included experimental compounds designed to enhance cognitive function while suppressing emotional responses that might interfere with rational decision-making and competitive performance. The chemical interventions transformed naturally empathetic and cooperative young people into calculating individuals who evaluated relationships primarily in terms of genetic fitness and survival advantage. The educational curriculum evolved to emphasize genetic theory, racial superiority, and biological destiny as core subjects that took precedence over traditional academic disciplines like literature, history, and social studies that might encourage empathy or moral reasoning. The children learned to view themselves as superior beings, whose genetic heritage entitled them to dominance over inferior human populations. Sarah Kim, a 10-year-old whose parents had been research scientists, adapted successfully to the vault's competitive environment while developing leadership skills that made her valuable for training other children in genetic superiority concepts. Her transformation from compassionate child to calculating eugenicist demonstrated how effectively the program could corrupt natural human development when applied with sufficient psychological pressure and pharmacological support. The breeding program that began when surviving children reached adolescence represented the culmination of the vault's genetic optimization objectives, with reproductive pairings determined entirely by genetic analysis rather than personal compatibility or emotional attachment. The young people were treated as breeding stock, whose primary value lay in their ability to produce genetically superior offspring. The graduation ceremonies conducted when subjects reached 18 years of age provided psychological closure for a program that had already achieved its primary objectives through genetic material harvesting and reproductive, manipulation, making the actual survival of individual subjects irrelevant to the broader eugenic goals. Most graduates were eliminated after their genetic contributions had been secured. The psychological profiles of surviving subjects revealed complete moral corruption and emotional dysfunction that made them unsuitable for integration into normal human society. even as their genetic material was preserved for future reproductive programs. The vault had successfully created genetically superior specimens who lacked the emotional capacity necessary for maintaining human civilization. Dr. Chen's research notes documented the systematic destruction of human empathy, creativity, and moral reasoning that occurred when children were raised in environments that prioritized genetic optimization over psychological development. His work provided unprecedented data about the relationship between nature and nurture, while creating human beings who possessed desired biological traits but lacked essential psychological characteristics. The facility's computer systems maintained detailed genetic databases and reproductive records that would enable future researchers to continue the master race program using preserved biological material, ensuring that the vault's work would continue even after its immediate subjects had been eliminated. The technology created permanent repositories for genetic information that could be accessed by subsequent eugenic programs. The vault's isolation from outside contact meant that its activities continued unobserved and unregulated by any external authority, allowing researchers to pursue genetic optimization without interference from moral constraints or legal restrictions that might have limited their experimental procedures. The children suffered and died without witness, except for the scientific personnel who viewed their pain as necessary for species improvement. The few children who survived the entire program emerged as psychologically damaged adults, whose genetic superiority was offset by complete inability to form meaningful relationships or contribute productively to human civilization, demonstrating the fundamental flaw in eugenic theory that assumed biological fitness could be separated from psychological and social development. The discovery of Vault 75 by post-war explorers revealed evidence of systematic child abuse and genetic experimentation that exceeded the worst atrocities of historical genocide programs, providing testimony to humanity's capacity for evil when scientific ambition was divorced from moral consideration and ethical constraint. The facility served as a monument to the dangers of reducing human beings to their biological components. The educational materials found throughout the vault documented how effectively propaganda and psychological manipulation could transform children's natural empathy and curiosity into calculating cruelty and genetic supremacism, revealing the techniques that totalitarian regimes had used throughout history to corrupt young people while enlisting them as agents of their own oppression. The medical records preserved in the vault's databases provided disturbing evidence of how scientific methodology could be used to rationalize and systematize the most heinous crimes against children, demonstrating that technical sophistication and academic credentials provided no protection against moral corruption when researchers abandoned ethical principles in pursuit of abstract theoretical goals. Step into the realm of absolute solitude, where isolation becomes madness and loneliness transforms consciousness into its own tormentor, where Vault 77 housed humanity's cruelest experiment in psychological destruction, the systematic study of what happens when a human mind is stripped of all companionship, all connection, all hope of ever again hearing another voice speak words of comfort or understanding in the endless silence that becomes both prison and executioner. The conceptual framework for Vault 77 emerged from pre-war psychological research into sensory deprivation and social isolation, as military researchers sought to understand how enemy prisoners might be broken through solitary confinement techniques that left no physical marks, while destroying mental resilience. The experiment was designed to establish the absolute limits of human psychological endurance when subjected to complete social isolation for extended periods. Dr. Patricia Wynne, the project's chief psychologist, had devoted her career to studying the relationship between social interaction and mental health, developing theories about the fundamental human need for companionship that made prolonged isolation a form of torture more devastating than physical violence. Her assignment to oversee Vault 77 represented the opportunity to test these theories under controlled conditions with a single subject. The selection of David Martinez as the Vault's sole occupant was based on psychological profiles that identified him as possessing exceptional mental stability, emotional resilience, and social adaptability, characteristics that researchers believed would enable him to survive extended isolation while providing meaningful data about the breakdown of human consciousness under extreme solitary conditions. Martinez was a 32-year-old librarian whose calm temperament and intellectual interests seemed ideal for the experiment. The Vault's design incorporated every comfort and convenience that a single person might require for indefinite survival, including automated food production systems, entertainment libraries, exercise equipment, and educational materials that could occupy a mind for decades. The facility was engineered to provide everything except the one thing that Martinez would need most desperately: a human contact. The sealed container that awaited Martinez's discovery after his first months of isolation contained hand puppets crafted with meticulous attention to detail, including facial expressions, clothing, and accessories that would enable them to serve as surrogate companions for a mind desperately seeking social interaction. The puppets were designed to provide just enough stimulus to maintain psychological function while studying how isolation affects the development of imaginary relationships. Martinez's initial adjustment to Vault life proceeded normally for the first 60 days, with daily routines of reading, exercise, and meal preparation providing structure that maintained his mental equilibrium, while he assumed that his isolation was temporary and that other Vault dwellers would eventually join him. His journals from this period reflected optimism and curiosity about his unusual circumstances. The discovery of the puppet container occurred during Martinez's third month of isolation, when prolonged solitude had begun affecting his psychological state in ways that made the artificial companions seem like miraculous gifts rather than pathetic substitutes for human interaction. His excitement at finding the puppets revealed how completely his need for companionship had overwhelmed his rational understanding of their true nature. The development of puppet personalities began as conscious role-playing that Martinez used to provide variety in his daily conversations with himself, but gradually evolved into elaborate character development that felt increasingly real as his isolated mind invested emotional significance in imaginary relationships. Each puppet acquired distinct voices, backgrounds, and behavioral patterns that reflected different aspects of Martinez's fragmented psyche. King Puppet emerged as Martinez's primary authority figure, representing the leadership and decision-making functions that he had abdicated to his imaginary companions, as his ability to make rational choices deteriorated under the pressure of prolonged isolation. The king served as both protector and oppressor, making decisions that Martinez could not face making himself while providing structure for his increasingly chaotic mental state. The puppet society that developed within the Vault reflected Martinez's unconscious understanding of social dynamics and power relationships, with hierarchies, conflicts, and alliances that mirrored human communities while remaining entirely products of a single isolated consciousness, desperate for the complexity that only social interaction could provide. The imaginary relationships became more real to Martinez than his own identity. The murder of King Puppet represented Martinez's first break from reality into active psychosis, as his identification with the imaginary characters became so complete that violence against the puppets felt like genuine homicide rather than destruction of inanimate objects. His investigation of the crime revealed his complete inability to distinguish between fantasy and reality in his isolated environment. The Vault-Tec boy puppet that Martinez discovered as the murderer became his constant companion and primary psychological influence, representing the darkest aspects of his personality that isolation had liberated from normal social constraints. The puppet encouraged antisocial behaviors and violent fantasies while providing rationalization for actions that Martinez's conscious mind would never have contemplated under normal circumstances. Martinez's venture into the wasteland marked his transition from isolated victim to active threat, as years of solitary madness had transformed him into something that retained human intelligence while lacking normal empathy or moral reasoning. His puppet companion served as external validation for internal voices that urged him toward violence and predation as expressions of his superiority over normal human beings. The encounters with wasteland bandits provided Martinez with his first human interaction in years, but his psychological development during isolation made normal social engagement impossible as he viewed other people through the distorted lens of puppet relationships and power dynamics. His attempts to communicate revealed the complete breakdown of his ability to distinguish between imaginary and real social interactions. The massacre of the bandit group demonstrated how completely Martinez's isolation experience had transformed him from victim to perpetrator, as he applied lessons learned from puppet violence to human victims, while his Vault-Tec boy companion provided commentary and encouragement. The killings were conducted with mechanical precision that reflected years of rehearsal with imaginary victims. The legend of the puppet man that spread throughout the wasteland represented collective trauma response to encounters with Martinez, as survivors struggled to process experiences with someone whose behavior combined human intelligence with complete moral vacancy. The puppet that accompanied him everywhere became a symbol of madness that transcended individual psychology to represent broader fears about isolation and social breakdown. The psychological documentation that Martinez had maintained throughout his isolation provided unprecedented insight into the progressive deterioration of human consciousness when deprived of social contact, revealing how imagination and fantasy could evolve into delusion and psychosis when not anchored by external reality provided through interaction with other people. The puppet dialogues that Martinez recorded during his early isolation showed normal role-playing activities that gradually transformed into genuine conversations with imaginary beings who possessed autonomous personalities, independent motivations. The progression from conscious fantasy to unconscious delusion illustrated how isolation could reshape perception and cognition in fundamental ways. The behavioral modifications that Martinez underwent during his years alone demonstrated how social norms and moral constraints depended entirely on ongoing human contact for their maintenance, with prolonged isolation allowing primitive impulses and antisocial tendencies to develop unchecked by the feedback and consequences that characterized normal community life. The Vault's monitoring systems recorded every aspect of Martinez's psychological deterioration, while preserving evidence of how a normal human being could be transformed into a monster through nothing more than the systematic deprivation of companionship and social interaction. The data provided unprecedented insight into the relationship between isolation and madness. The puppet collection that Martinez had assembled and modified during his isolation revealed his artistic and creative responses to psychological stress, as he developed increasingly sophisticated characters and narratives that reflected both his intelligence and his growing detachment from reality. The puppets became repositories for aspects of his personality that could no longer be integrated into coherent identity. The territory that Martinez claimed in the wasteland became a zone of terror, where travelers learned to fear the appearance of a lone figure accompanied by hand puppets. Understanding that such encounters often ended in violence, that served no rational purpose beyond the entertainment of a mind that had lost all connection to normal human motivation and social understanding. The philosophical implications of Martinez's transformation encompassed fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness, social identity, and moral reasoning, revealing how completely individual psychology depended on ongoing interaction with other people for its maintenance and development. His case demonstrated that isolation could be more destructive than any physical torture. The puppet performances that Martinez conducted for himself during his years of isolation reflected his desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of social interaction, while revealing how imagination could become both salvation and damnation for minds deprived of genuine human contact. The shows provided structure and meaning while accelerating his descent into madness. The vault's empty chambers remained monuments to the experiment's success in demonstrating the absolute necessity of human companionship for maintaining psychological health and moral reasoning, while serving as warnings about the consequences of treating social isolation as acceptable research methodology when applied to conscious beings capable of suffering. Navigate now through the scattered chambers of lesser horrors, where humanity's capacity for cruelty found expression in 1,000 smaller experiments that together painted a comprehensive portrait of institutional evil disguised as scientific progress. These vaults, though less notorious than their infamous siblings, contributed their own chapters to the encyclopedia of suffering that Vault Tech compiled through decades of systematic torture masquerading as research into human nature and social behavior. Vault 19 stood as testament to paranoia weaponized against community cohesion, where residents were deliberately segregated into competing factions through architectural design and social manipulation that transformed neighbors into enemies, while researchers observed the breakdown of trust and cooperation under artificially induced stress. The vault's population was divided into red and blue sections, with each group receiving different information about vault conditions, resource availability, and external threats that made cooperation impossible while encouraging suspicion and hostility. The isolation chambers within Vault 19 were designed to appear as luxury private quarters while actually serving as psychological torture devices that prevented meaningful social interaction between residents who shared common interests, backgrounds, or family relationships. The chamber's sophisticated monitoring systems recorded every conversation, analyzed behavioral patterns, and provided researchers with detailed data about how social isolation could be used to break down community bonds even within confined populations. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Vault's chief psychologist, implemented protocols that systematically undermined resident morale through carefully timed announcements about imaginary external threats, fictional resource shortages, and non-existent equipment failures that created artificial crises requiring group cooperation that the Vault's design made impossible to achieve. Her manipulation techniques were so sophisticated that residents never suspected their conflicts were artificially generated rather than naturally occurring. The competitive games and activities that structured daily life in Vault 19 were designed to reward antisocial behavior while punishing cooperation, creating social dynamics that encouraged residents to view their neighbors as obstacles to personal success rather than partners in collective survival. The point systems, ranking hierarchies, and resource allocation mechanisms all reinforced individualistic competition over community cooperation. Vault 34 represented the logical conclusion of American gun culture taken to its most extreme expression, where weapons stockpiling and martial ideology were encouraged to the point where violence became the primary mechanism for resolving disputes and establishing social hierarchy. The Vault's armory contained enough weapons to equip a small army, with residents encouraged to view armed conflict as normal and necessary for maintaining order. The training programs implemented in Vault 34 emphasized combat skills, weapons proficiency, and tactical thinking, while deliberately neglecting conflict resolution, diplomacy, and peaceful problem-solving techniques that might have enabled residents to maintain social stability without resorting to violence. The educational curriculum treated warfare as humanity's natural state, while presenting peace as temporary aberration. The inevitable civil war that erupted within Vault 34 was not accidental but carefully orchestrated through resource restrictions, territorial disputes, and artificial scarcity that made violent competition seem necessary for survival. The researchers documented every battle, analyzed casualty patterns, and recorded tactical innovations, while residents killed each other in conflicts that served no purpose beyond providing data for military strategists. The radiation flooding that ultimately destroyed Vault 34 occurred when combat damage compromised the facility's nuclear reactor containment systems, creating contamination levels that forced evacuation, while demonstrating how easily militarized communities could destroy themselves through the same weapons they believed provided security. The Vault became uninhabitable through its residents' own violence. Vault 95 embodied the cruelest form of hope, manipulated and destroyed, where recovering drug addicts were provided with perfect therapeutic environments for overcoming their addictions, only to have their progress systematically sabotaged through the introduction of pure drugs at moments when their psychological defenses were weakest and their commitment to recovery was strongest. The therapeutic programs in Vault 95 incorporated the most advanced addiction treatment methodologies available, including counseling, medical support, and social rehabilitation activities that enabled residents to overcome chemical dependencies they had struggled with for years. Their success in achieving sobriety and rebuilding their lives provided genuine hope that recovery was possible, even for the most severely addicted individuals. Dr. Patricia Chen, the Vault's addiction specialist, genuinely believed she was implementing revolutionary treatment protocols that would serve as models for post-war rehabilitation programs, working with residents who had volunteered for experimental therapy in exchange for guaranteed access to clean living environments and professional medical support. Her dedication to their welfare was authentic and complete. The sabotage of recovery programs occurred through the systematic introduction of pure chemical substances into the Vault's environment at precisely calculated intervals, designed to trigger relapse episodes when residents were most vulnerable to temptation. The timing was based on detailed psychological profiles that identified individual weakness patterns and optimal moments for breaking down sobriety. The psychological devastation that resulted from orchestrated relapse episodes exceeded anything the residents had experienced during their pre-Vault addiction struggles, as they were forced to confront not only their own weakness, but the deliberate betrayal of trust by institutions and professionals they had believed were committed to their welfare. The experience destroyed their faith in recovery, while reinforcing their dependence on substances that had nearly killed them. The cycle of recovery and relapse that characterized Vault 95 created a form of psychological torture that was perhaps more cruel than outright murder, as residents experienced hope and progress, only to have their achievements systematically destroyed through manipulation that made their failures seem like personal inadequacy rather than institutional betrayal. Vault 111 demonstrated how religious faith could be corrupted and weaponized against believers through the systematic manipulation of spiritual practices and theological doctrine to serve research objectives rather than genuine spiritual development. The Vault's population consisted entirely of devoutly religious families who had been promised the opportunity to maintain their faith practices in underground sanctuary. The religious programming implemented in Vault 111 gradually corrupted traditional theology through subtle modifications to scripture, doctrine, and ritual practice that transformed peaceful religious expression into violent extremism while residents remained convinced they were following authentic spiritual guidance. The changes were introduced so gradually that believers accepted each modification as legitimate religious development. The theological experiments conducted in Vault 111 revealed how easily religious conviction could be redirected toward harmful purposes when spiritual authority was corrupted by researchers who viewed faith as psychological weakness to be exploited rather than strength to be respected. The Vault's history provided unprecedented data about the relationship between religious belief and social behavior. Vault 106 incorporated advanced virtual reality technology to create artificial environments where residents believed they were living normal surface lives while actually remaining underground and under constant observation. The simulations were so sophisticated that subjects never suspected their experiences were artificial rather than genuine. The psychological effects of discovering that their entire perceived reality had been artificial and created trauma that exceeded anything the residents might have experienced from honest acknowledgement of their underground imprisonment. The revelation that years of memories, relationships, and achievements were nothing more than computer-generated experiences destroyed their ability to trust their own perceptions and judgments about reality. The pattern that emerged across all these lesser-known vaults revealed Vault-Tech's systematic approach to cataloging every possible form of human suffering, while disguising torture as legitimate scientific research into social behavior, psychological resilience, and community organization. Each experiment contributed data to a comprehensive understanding of human vulnerability that could be exploited for control purposes. The administrative documents found across multiple Vault sites demonstrated that the experimental programs were coordinated from central headquarters that viewed individual human lives as expendable resources in service of broader research. Objectives related to population control, social engineering, and psychological manipulation techniques that could be applied to post-war governance. The standardization of torture methodologies across different Vault installations revealed that the suffering inflicted on residents was not accidental or incidental to legitimate research, but central to experimental designs that treated human pain as measurable data rather than moral consideration, requiring ethical constraint and humanitarian limitation. The comprehensive nature of Vault-Tech's experimental program encompassed every aspect of human experience and social organization, from individual psychology to community dynamics, ensuring that post-war authorities would possess detailed knowledge about how to control survivor populations through techniques that had been tested and refined on unwilling subjects who had trusted their government to protect rather than exploit them. Draw now toward the culmination of our journey through these steel tombs where humanity's trust was betrayed and hope transformed into horror, where the accumulated weight of systematic cruelty reveals truths about our species that we would prefer never to have learned. The vaults of America stand as monuments, not merely to individual suffering, but to the institutional capacity for evil that emerges when power is divorced from compassion and science abandons its moral foundation. The pattern that emerges across all Vault Tech installations reveals a coordinated program of human experimentation that exceeded in scope and sophistication any previous attempt to catalogue the limits of human endurance and psychological resilience. Each vault contributed data to a comprehensive understanding of how communities could be controlled, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed through techniques that appeared benevolent while serving objectives that were fundamentally malevolent. The residents who entered these facilities carried with them the accumulated hopes and dreams of pre-war civilization, believing that their sacrifice of freedom would purchase safety for themselves and their children while contributing to humanity's survival in a world transformed by atomic fire. Their trust was absolute, because they could not conceive that institutions claiming to serve their welfare would deliberately engineer their suffering for purposes they were never permitted to understand. The children who suffered in these underground laboratories represent perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Vault program, as young lives were corrupted, destroyed, or transformed into instruments of the same institutional evil that had claimed their parents. Those who survived emerged into a world that had been shaped by the very experiments that had stolen their innocence, finding themselves both victims and products of a system designed to perpetuate human suffering across generations. The scientific staff who administered these programs demonstrate how easily moral reasoning can be corrupted when individual conscience is subordinated to institutional authority and abstract research objectives. Many began their Vault assignments with genuine humanitarian intentions, only to discover that their expertise was being used to refine techniques for causing precisely the suffering they had devoted their careers to alleviating. The psychological mechanisms that enabled otherwise decent people to participate in systematic torture reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and social organization that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of post-war survival. The Vault experiments succeeded because they exploited normal human tendencies toward obedience, conformity, and trust in authority figures who claim to possess knowledge and wisdom beyond ordinary understanding. The data collected through decades of human experimentation was never used for its ostensible purpose of improving post-war survival and social organization, instead serving primarily to demonstrate that human beings could be convinced to accept any amount of suffering if that suffering was presented as necessary for achieving abstract goals like scientific progress, national security, or species improvement that justified individual sacrifice for collective benefit. The lasting impact of the Vault program extends beyond its immediate victims to encompass broader questions about the relationship between individual rights and collective authority, the ethical limits of scientific research, and the moral responsibilities of institutions that claim to serve public welfare while pursuing objectives that contradict their stated humanitarian mission. The survivors who eventually emerged from these facilities carried with them not only physical and psychological trauma, but knowledge about human capacity for both evil and resilience that would influence post-war civilization in ways that the original researchers never anticipated. Their experiences served as warnings about the dangers of unchecked institutional power, while demonstrating that human dignity could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. The empty vaults that remain scattered across the wasteland serve as museums of human suffering and institutional betrayal, preserving evidence of what happens when scientific ambition is divorced from ethical consideration and governmental authority operates without meaningful accountability to the people it claims to serve. These monuments remind us that progress without moral foundation becomes regression disguised as advancement. The philosophical legacy of the Vault program encompasses fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and moral reasoning that remain relevant to any civilization that must balance individual welfare against collective objectives while maintaining the ethical constraints that separate legitimate governance from systematic oppression, disguised as benevolent administration, serving the greater good of an abstract future that never materializes. And so, we close the steel doors one final time on these monuments to humanity's capacity for cruelty disguised as progress. Each vault stands as testament to what happens when science abandons ethics, when survival becomes excuse for the inexcusable. The children who emerged, the ghouls who wandered, the mutants who raged, all carry the scars of trust betrayed by those who promised protection. As you drift towards sleep, remember that these vaults were built not by monsters, but by people who convinced themselves that any experiment was justified if it served the greater good. The true horror lies not in mutation or madness, but in the calculated abandonment of human dignity for the sake of knowledge. Rest now, knowing that even in humanity's darkest chapter, some chose compassion over compliance, love over loyalty to inhuman systems. Sweet dreams, wanderer.